Saying nice things about Silent Hill Downpour? This might be my shortest video. I'll admit, I was quite jaded against Silent Hill Downpour when it first released over 10 years ago in 2012. I and many of the Silent Hill fans out there felt the Western entries in the Silent Hill series just missed the point, and they would do annoying things like cram Pyramid Head in where he didn't belong. And those entries were lacking things like the subtle atmosphere or striking imagery, interesting monster design, and sometimes they would borrow from things like the Silent Hill movies rather than continuing on the established lore. Downpour was just another reminder of how dead my favorite Japanese developed horror franchise truly was, and I kind of projected a lot of hatred towards it and the other Western developed games because at the time I just couldn't see past my fanboy blinders and appreciate Downpour for the good things it did. Well, it's been about 10 years since we've had a proper Silent Hill game, and you know what? It's starting to look pretty good. Yeah, I could take that home. Play it a little bit, maybe nuzzle it, give it a little smooch. We're gonna need some alone time. Let's be clear, this is not a video where I'm going to attempt to exonerate Silent Hill Downpour of all of its flaws or claim the critics at the time were wrong for not liking it. This is more of a challenge for myself to take a game that I hate and give it another look, maybe see if there's a silver lining to it. So I think the best way to go about that is to take a look at all the different versions of Silent Hill Downpour and figure out which one is the least bad. I used to think Silent Hill Downpour was the ugliest in the series. From my vague recollections of it, I just remember it being very muddy and uninspired when it came to the design. It had the Pacific Northwestern vistas found within Alan Wake, but designed with the budget of Deadly Premonition. So I decided to check out a few different versions of the game to see if any one of them could enhance my Downpour experience. We'll start with the PlayStation 3 version. At launch, this version was plagued with a terrible frame rate, and to Konami's credit, they did release one patch to address it, but personally, I don't believe it did anything to improve it. The game barely manages to maintain 20 frames per second, let alone 30, which is the target frame rate. If you pan the camera around Murphy, you'll notice the frames start to split around the X-axis. This is called screen tearing, and it's a frequent problem within Downpour on PS3. I also made note that when Murphy is doing a running cycle, occasionally his animation starts to stutter, and once I saw this, I couldn't unsee it. Both the 360 and PS3 versions of Downpour are 3D compatible. Since I own a PlayStation 3D monitor, I decided I'd give it a go. Starting out, the game doesn't offer too many instances where things pop out of the screen, but it started to become more apparent in the way that they design most of the shots within the game. They use a shallow depth of field in many of the cutscenes, where the character is the only object in focus and the background is blurred out. The first thing that literally stuck out to me were the UI elements. Whenever you're looking at any of the notes, you have this little UI here in this bar. Right here is what sticks out. To Silent Hill Downpour's credit, you can turn off the tutorial hints, button prompts, and object highlighting, which keeps the player's focus entirely reserved for the environment around them. I'd highly recommend turning all those off before playing in 3D. I didn't really start to pick up on the 3D until I hit the Devil's Pit Stop, the diner scene within the game. When I stood in this spot, I could see the depth of the room. With ketchup bottles, the burger, the coffee machine. You can even see some of the layers of the fog here. And there's the pillar and all that good stuff. Yeah, there is some real depth here. What I really wanted to see were the otherworld transitions. This is where the 3D effect truly shines. I was totally taken by how well these scenes were done. Yeah, this is a spot that really demonstrates the 3D effect because you can see the depth all the way up to that door. And there is a mesh on the sides here so you can see through the fence line, and there's a bit of depth to that pipe. It works really well here where there's a fixed camera angle so you can kind of see all the dimensions of the room, the four corners here. Let's try throwing this pan. Okay, let's try that again. Let's see if I can throw it at the camera. That actually came up close. That shot out. I'm surprised that worked. There is some trippiness going on with the 3D, so when these hallways push down, it really does emphasize the depth. All the particles and ash flying into your face. I gotta be honest with you, it makes the water slides a bit easier so you can tell what's coming up. The effect really works well whenever there's a lot of objects and layers, as you would expect. This alone might have changed my entire perspective on Silent Hill Downpour. This is just incredible. And I think this was one of the most overlooked features. Almost no one talked about this. And it's a shame because I think it really does highlight all the care that was put into at least the otherworld segments. The cutscenes, not so much. The town, not so much. But the otherworld segments are a thing of beauty. I would highly recommend trying it out in 3D. If only there was a way to take Silent Hill Downpour and make it look as good as the PlayStation 2 Silent Hill games. I've got an idea. So I connected my PlayStation 3 to my Sony Trinitron CRT via component cables and ran the game in standard definition in a 4:3 aspect ratio. And the results were baffling. All the black levels look super accurate here, and not everything looks all washed out and nasty. You'll notice that with a lot of horror games is like they blow out all the black levels and they look just so gray and muddy. The lighting in the darkness, especially the black levels over here, look super accurate. The darkest of dark. Not only did the game output darker black levels and brighter brights, but because of the aperture grille of my Trinitron, it helped hide some of the rougher looking aspects of Silent Hill Downpour's texture. Presented in this retro fashion, Downpour looks like a high-end PlayStation 2 game, and that's a compliment coming from me. But besides the visual enhancements, there were some performance gains from the standard definition version. Things are looking good. In fact, the frame rate is ridiculously smooth. I'm not exaggerating here. This is smoother than the Xbox Series X. Look how smooth this frame rate is. This is insane. I can't believe this worked. My best guess is that the drop in resolution allowed the game to free up some resources, and it provides a smoother and more consistent frame rate, and it also seemed to eliminate the screen tearing problem as well. So if you want to play the PS3 version, I feel the definitive way to do it is on a CRT in standard definition 4:3 aspect ratio. Try it out yourself and you'll be amazed. It's almost excusable in this form. It's really close. This is the intended way to play though. Play it on a CRT, cheapest cables you can find. Let's take a look at Silent Hill Downpour on the Xbox Series X, considering that this is one of the only modern ways to play this game nowadays, since Konami has been rather stingy about porting the series to modern-day consoles. Playing Silent Hill Downpour on the Xbox Series X improves a lot of the performance problems that I had on the PlayStation 3. It locks the frame rate at a consistent 30 frames. I did not notice any drops during my playthrough, even during moments where the action was intense and there were a lot of different particle effects, notably during the otherworld transitions. It also removed all screen tearing due to the forced VSync that's present in all the backwards compatible titles. And as an added benefit, it made all the cutscenes less headache inducing. Hooray!
Pretty impressive, ain't it?
And if you're playing on a 4K display, it adds auto HDR, which adds a bit of polish to already pretty decent lighting effects. Oddly enough, the biggest improvement came from the place I least expected. The Xbox version came in louder and presented a dynamic range of instruments and sounds that were muffled in the PS3 version. For some reason, it was mixed quieter and lacked the dynamic range of sound when compared to the Xbox version. Let's take a listen to the differences between this cutscene on both the PS3 and Xbox Series X version to illustrate what I mean.
Wicked old beast, ain't she? What? I said she's a wicked old beast. Me, I'm partial to something with a little less rust. But to each his own. Wicked old beast, ain't she? What? I said she's a wicked old beast. Me, I'm partial to something with a little less rust. But to each his own. Wicked old beast, ain't she? What? I said she's a wicked old beast. Me, I'm partial to something with a little less rust. But to each his own.
I thought the work of Daniel Licht was a tad understated when compared to the soundtracks of the prior Silent Hill games, but this opinion was formed around the PS3 version, where all of his efforts were completely butchered in the mix. I gotta say, the Series X version gave me a whole new outlook on Silent Hill Downpour. The clarity here on both the visual and audio fronts really makes for a more enjoyable experience. My only complaint is that the game is still locked at 30 frames, and I would love to see the backwards compatibility team at Microsoft push out a 60 frames patch like they've done with other backwards compatible titles. I feel an improved frame rate is the missing piece this game needs to make it the best it could possibly be. Regardless, if you've played Silent Hill Downpour in the past and didn't enjoy it, or this is your first introduction to the game, you might walk away with a better appreciation for the game than somebody who had only experienced it on the PlayStation 3. It's clear to me that the game was hamstrung by a combination of buggy programming and the lack of resources provided by the 7th generation of console hardware. Unfortunately, the game never got officially released on PC, which could have afforded the game more opportunities to reach its full potential in terms of performance and visual fidelity. This is where the PS3 emulator, RPCS3, comes to the rescue. In recent times, the compatibility of the emulator has jumped up to 66% of the entire PS3 library, and it's growing by the day. I'm happy to share that Silent Hill Downpour is now fully playable. Now, your mileage may vary when it comes to performance based on the specs of your PC. I've included the specs of mine in the bottom left corner so you know what I'm working with. I was kind of new to PlayStation 3 emulation, so I started researching what kind of mods were available to the user. I found that RPCS3 had a built-in patch database in which developers could contribute patches to. This is where I discovered that our old pal Illusion, whom I had featured in a segment about 60 frames patches on PlayStation 4 games in the past, had created a patch specifically to unlock the frame rate for Silent Hill Downpour. Whoa, this is the smoothest Downpour has ever played. The patch completely eliminates all the frame pacing issues I had with the console versions. I did not experience any hitches in the usual spots or in the other world sequences. Instead of noticing how the game was struggling to run, I could now reserve my focus on the action of the moment. Illusion's work here is commendable. They have officially polished this turd and transformed it into gold. Now, the PS3 emulator version is not perfect. It still has the occasional texture flickering, and it will frequently compile shaders while you're playing. But if you can look past those minor issues, it is a gorgeous looking version of the game. Once you start playing in 60 frames, it's kinda hard to go back to 30. For fun, let's compare all three versions. On the far left side, you'll note that the PS3 version is a bit muddier in the texture quality, and the frame rate, of course, is locked at 30 frames. Overall, the image looks a tad washed out. The Series X version's in the middle, and the clarity of this image is far superior to both the PS3 and emulated version. But I imagine if I toggled some settings on the PS3 emulator, I could match this clarity. Both versions are gorgeous regardless. regardless. I will note that the PS3 emulated version also has the lower quality audio that's present in the PS3 version, and if audio fidelity is something important to you, then I recommend the Series X version. Each version has its own set of benefits and drawbacks, so I hope this segment has helped somebody out there decide which version is best for them.
That's a hell of a drop. All right, Murphy, it's all set. Make it quick, huh?
In the game's prologue, we're introduced to our incarcerated protagonist, Murphy Pendleton. And no, we're not given a reason for why he's locked up in the first place. That'll come later. George Sewell, a crooked corrections officer, makes some sort of off-screen deal with Murphy so he can acquire some alone time in the showers with another inmate, Patrick Napier.
Jesus, you scared the hell out of me.
Murphy has some unknown grudge against Patrick, and at this moment reveals they used to be neighbors. That's the only piece of substantial history we're given before Murphy brutally murders Patrick. Props to Vatra for creating the most uncomfortable tutorial in gaming history. Even though the writers attempted to obfuscate the motivation behind the shanking, it's quite obvious from the line, "I'm a sequestered prisoner," which gives away what sort of crime Patrick committed. My main issue with this scene is more to do with how the writers attempted to rationalize the cold-blooded murder of Patrick by leaving no room for doubt in regards to his crimes. The way Patrick is designed lacks subtlety, to the point where I'm surprised they just didn't call him Chester and give him a creepy van to drive around. Oh, wait, they did do that last part. What I'm saying is there's no ambiguity to whether or not he's guilty of child murder / rape. The player is biased against this fat, wall-eyed bastard from the jump, and we don't ever question if Murphy was justified here. Just take a long look at him. Yeah, he's guilty. I think it would have been much more effective to tone down Patrick's design as less grotesque, perhaps humanize him so the player might have some reasonable doubt and possibly start to sympathize with him before the horrible truth is revealed.
Why?
You know exactly why.
The imagery in this game is a little too on the nose, that's all I'm saying. Murphy awakens from the nightmare of killing Patrick, and he's perp-walked out to a prison bus where he will undergo a transfer to another prison. I do enjoy the music Daniel Lick composed for this moment, as he paid homage to Akira Yamaoka's work on the original Silent Hill with all the mandolin strumming. This is also the only appearance of Mary Elizabeth McGlynn's vocals.
My boy, you my boy! Woo! Come on back anytime. You still owe me, man.
I just wish Daniel's work had more of a presence in the rest of the game, but it's whatever. To summarize the setup, the story as a whole rehashes the familiar beats of Silent Hill 2, where you're given a protagonist with a vague past who may have done something irredeemable in it. Then, through an act of Deus Ex gyromancy, they're placed into Silent Hill to engage in either an act of self-punishment or redemption. Sure, we've seen it all before, but have we seen it with rain? Let's get down to brass tacks. Murphy can find a walkie-talkie, which is the game's enemy radar this time around.
Police radio? That'll come in handy.
Now, some reviewers never picked it up and then criticized the game for not having a radio.
Moving through the desolate town is no walk in the park, as you'll encounter multitudes of monstrous baddies to impede your escape. Expect no radio static warning, though, since the handy device has been completely excised from the game.
Police radio? That'll come in handy.
Not that it matters, since you're just gonna hear music every time you encounter enemies anyway. I think at one point, Downpour was going to utilize the walkie-talkie as a tool to introduce stealth into the gameplay, in a similar fashion to Silent Hill Shattered Memories, where Harry Mason would use a combination of his radio and the ability to peek through doorways as a means to locate the position of monsters. What's weird is that Downpour lifted this door-peeking mechanic from Silent Hill Shattered Memories, but does not present any scenario where it's needed. There's no stealth in this game, but I digress. Throughout the story, Murphy is being pursued by Officer Ann Cunningham, who is quite vigilant in her duty to apprehend him.
You're gonna get yourself killed.
Shut up.
Keep your goddamn hands where I can see them.
Once again, we're not given any background into their relationship, and then we're forced into a press button to morality event that was used to limited effect in Silent Hill Homecoming. Without getting too far ahead of myself, there is a karma system at play in Downpour that's determined based on these morality events. There's only like a few choices in the game that you can make, and they're either evil or good with no in between.
Yeah, that's right. Take the easy way out. That's what cowards do, right?
And the karma is also determined on whether or not Murphy decides to knock out the enemies or kill them. Killing them, of course, is negative karma. There's no sort of indicator of where Murphy's karma is sitting, like a physical change or something like that. You just kind of have to commit to what sort of Murphy you want to be from the get-go until the very end of the game. And like most of the game's mechanics, it's a cool idea, but half-baked in its implementation. What can I say? The game has a bit of a rocky start, but things will start to pick up around the time you reach the Devil's Pit Stop. There, Murphy meets Howard Blackwood, a postman for the town of Silent Hill, who mostly just meanders about and dispenses some ominous dialogue before wandering off to go do his own thing. There's a jump scare in this scene where Murphy sees something in this window, then he looks away, and then he looks back and it's gone. And I have spent hours of my life analyzing this frame to figure out what this is, and I've arrived at this conclusion.
Something wrong, son?
Did you see it? Up there in the window.
Inside the diner, Murphy attempts to stop a kitchen fire, and in doing so causes the sprinkler system to flood the room, which then triggers the transition to the other world, which in this game is expressed as some sort of personal hell projected from within Murphy's subconscious, which caters itself specifically to Murphy's past using symbolic imagery of things that relate back to his life, which projects itself upon the physical environment, but I think other people can also explore and see it. So I'm not sure if it's like a psychological horror or the town itself is just creating this shit, or whatever, doesn't matter. These segments are the greatest spectacles the game provides, and I quite enjoyed the 20 minutes or so you spend in them. Inside the other world, Murphy is pursued by a ball of light referred to as the Void, and I can't tell you what it's supposed to represent in relationship to Murphy because it's never commented upon by him or referenced to any degree in the plot. Maybe it's a reference to the Deadlights from Stephen King's It. Wouldn't be the first reference. Once again, these void chase sequences are ripped directly from Silent Hill's Shattered Memories, where Harry would run from monsters known as Rorschachs. Players complained these sequences were annoying and felt ganged up on by the monsters. Despite the fact that Harry had multiple ways to avoid them, the aforementioned radio/door peek, he could hide in closets and wait for them to just leave. If he was caught, he could look behind him and see how close they were and then throw objects in their pathway to slow them down, and if all else failed, he could just bust out a flare and stun them all and run away. Apparently, these mechanics were lost on the average Shattered Memories player, so Vatra decided to just dumb down the whole formula to just running away and dropping debris, and that's it. The void encounters and water slides destroy a pretty interesting atmosphere, and then replace it with the cheap thrills of a theme park haunted house, and not the good kind. About 40 minutes into the game, Murphy will encounter the game's first monster in the most embarrassing fashion.
Let go, that's what you don't understand!
This leads me to my biggest gripe with the gameplay: the combat. The combat in Downpour is downright poor.
You gotta be kidding me.
In the defense of Vatra, they had received fan feedback from players who felt the combat within Silent Hill Homecoming was far too easy, and they desired something that was a bit more shoddy and traditional. Silent Hill Homecoming put players into the role of Alex Shepard, a man who had allegedly served in the military and had combat training. As broken as this combat is, I will say Homecoming did provide provide the most entertaining fight sequences throughout the entire series. I really liked that when Alex would attack enemies, he would leave battle damage on them. He could also dodge and weave out of the way, and he also had a cheesy stun locking combo with the knife, which is kind of fun to pull off once you get the hang of it. The critics of Homecoming's combat were absolutely right. It's an easy game even on the hardest of difficulties, and if you don't feel the threat as a protagonist in a survival horror game, then what's the point?
You lost the feeling of being vulnerable, because that's what survival horror is about. It's about being disempowered and being preyed upon. Instead
of using Silent Hill Homecoming as a reference point for combat within Downpour, they went further back to Silent Hill Origins. In Origins, you play as a trucker named Travis, who had no combat experience, but he did possess magic pants. Travis could pick up any of the objects he found laying on the map, put them in his pants, and then whip them out and use them as a weapon at any given time. The weapons here were breakable, yet plentiful. The problem with Origins is you never felt strapped for weapons, since Travis could just pull whatever he wanted out of his pants. They attempted to balance out this issue in Downpour by only allowing Murphy to carry one melee weapon and one gun at a time. Weapons can be broken, or in some cases outright lost because you progress the story and then you're just left with no weapons. Some tension is built when the player is forced to find a replacement weapon on the fly in the heat of battle. While this is a step in the right direction, the combat still has its share of problems. All of the enemies you encounter in the game are humanoid-type creatures. There's the Screamers, which, as the title suggests, can scream and stun Murphy, forcing you to pull off a QTE real quick so you can recover and continue combat. They also have an attack where they can grab Murphy, jump on his back, and then you have to perform another QTE to shake them off. As for the other enemies in the game, they just boil down to prisoners, and then reskins of prisoners, the cave monsters from The Descent, this monocle man that talks some shit and is never seen again, big fat pedophile, a disco ball, the raincoat killer from Deadly Premonition, a sex doll with ghost farts, squirty guy, and a spoiler guy. Almost all the other monsters in the game have some sort of stunning move that they can pull on Murphy, and as a result, the enemy encounters feel more like a frequent annoyance rather than a terrifying encounter. I especially dislike when you're doing a puzzle and you're about to solve it, and all of a sudden, a gang of prisoner monsters ambush you. Take my advice. Most times it's better off to just let them kill you where you stand, so they will despawn, and Murphy, he'll come back with full health, and then you can just continue on doing your puzzle. I would not say at any point was I having fun in this combat, and if that was the intended outcome, mission accomplished. In most cases, I was just incentivized to run away, but there are several choke points throughout the game where you have to fight in a gauntlet against multiple different types of enemies, and that's where the game really falls apart on the harder difficulties, because they flip things around and all the enemies can stun lock you and make quick work of Murphy. However, there does exist one cheesy exploit that you can take advantage of if you do want to try the harder difficulties. Murphy can acquire a few different firearms throughout the game. As you would expect from a survival horror, ammo is scarce, so you want to make sure you're being accurate with placing your shots. Due to a giant oversight by Vatra, if Murphy fires one of the guns in blind fire mode, he will hit a target 100% of the time. This is pretty much your ace in the hole for hard mode, and since the game will often strip you of all of your weapons due to some of the cutscenes, you might as well use your ammo or lose it. Murphy Aimbot Pendleton can also take advantage of this exploit when throwing objects. I beat one of the hardest bosses in the game by just picking up random shit and pelting him with it and walking away. This is the entirety of this battle on hard mode. I know this looks sad, but it was kind of fun. A big point of contention for the Silent Hill fanbase laid within the game's music department. Series composer Akira Yamaoka, who had worked on every single Silent Hill game up until this point, left to go work on Shadows of the Damned, and in his place came Daniel Licht, who had a background in film and television, notably working as the lead composer for the Dexter series. Well, I'm not one to speak ill of the dead here. Daniel's work is just exactly what he was paid to do. It's inoffensive and forgettable at worst, and no matter what, you have to understand that Akira Yamaoka's shoes were exceptionally big ones to fill, so no matter who took over or how good the end result would have been, it would have always been held to a high degree of scrutiny by the Silent Hill fanbase. Which it was. No doubt about it, Yamaoka left a massive imprint on the series. Up until this point, Akira was a constant element found in each game. So when he stepped away to work on Shadows of the Damned, it was cause for otherworldly sirens coming from the fan base. Side note, the Shadows of the Damned soundtrack is exceptional and it sounds like a lost Silent Hill soundtrack. You have to understand that Licht worked primarily in television and film, so he was taking those subtle atmosphere-setting sensibilities and applying them to the context of a game world for the first time. He did not aim to replicate or upstage the work of Yamaoka. From the interviews at the time, Daniel kind of accepted that he was going to be seen as a scab no matter what.
I think a lot of the fans were a little bit annoyed that Akira wasn't doing it.
I think fans tended to overlook that Daniel Licht also paid tribute to Akira's work in the game. For example, the soundtrack also contained several throwbacks to the original game's music, like when Murphy drops some coins in the jukebox at the diner. There were also some recycled sound effects from Silent Hill, like when Murphy picks up an item. Outside of enemy encounters and cutscenes, Licht's presence is mostly absent, and even after re-listening to the soundtrack for this video, a lot of the music outside of the opening stuff is largely forgettable. Believe it or not, Daniel Licht wasn't the most controversial addition to this game's soundtrack. In comes Jonathan Davis of the nu metal band Korn, who was hired to compose the game's theme song, Silent Hill. And the fan base lost their minds. Let me introduce you to an online petition known as No Korn in Silent Hill, aka Operation Kornami. Most Silent Hill fans are extremely sad to see that it has been decided to use Korn to make their theme song in the upcoming Silent Hill Downpour. There is many reasons for this. A nu metal band simply does not belong in Silent Hill, and especially not one that deals with teenage angst themes. Wait a second, wouldn't Korn be the perfect band that deals with teenage angst themes? Whatever. That is not what Silent Hill is or will ever be, and a nu metal band that was cool in the late 90s and early 2000s will do no good for Silent Hill as a game. Neither will it do much good for the game's reputation. We have already seen gaming journalists with the headlines like, "Barf, Korn to do Silent Hill Downpour's theme song." Some people say bad press is better than no press, but do we really want the Silent Hill franchise to be known as the game people make fun of?
From now on, if anyone makes fun of me, I'll kill him! Just like that.
Or the deep and amazing experience we usually know it for? Korn has never done anything that is remotely fitting for the Silent Hill atmosphere and represents everything that Silent Hill isn't. We don't know if it's Vatra who made the decision or if it's Konami pushing it on them, but it's sad and it shows a complete lack of respect for the fans, and we hope that Konami will very unlikely cancel the deal they made with Korn, or at the very least show our disapproval with this. We hope that Silent Hill Downpour Downpour is a quality title. They really don't. They want it to suck. But the news of Korn as the main theme makers makes us believe that Konami don't understand Silent Hill or its fanbase one bit. The Silent Hill fanbase is very dedicated and don't take news like this very lightly. Capiche? Reading Silent Hill forums and Facebook pages shows a collective depression amongst fans. Please, Konami, show some respect for Silent Hill and the fans and don't have Korn do the main themes for Silent Hill Downpour. Sincerely, the undersigned. I want to come out and say it. Jonathan Davis was actually a smart choice to compose this game's theme song. Hear me out. Silent Hill Downpour deals with a very dark subject matter of child abuse. And Jonathan Davis's band Korn often tackled that subject in their songs. Jonathan Davis wrote a lot of lyrics from his own personal experiences in dealing with child abuse, and I think he had a very unique and authentic perspective to lend to that subject matter. Unfortunately, his contributions here were kind of mishandled. Whilst Jonathan may have had the talent and perspective to lend, he wasn't given much direction or information about Silent Hill to draw from. He just had a general outline of the plot and a trailer to work with, so admittedly, he winged it. I also found an interview where Jonathan said he lifted a song from an album that he was already working on and just recycled it for the game instead of creating something new.
When I saw your name on Silent Hill back then, it was Downpour, right?
Yeah.
The Downpour. I was like, oh, that's nice. If you haven't heard that song, check it out.
It was cool. It's actually from this record that I was working on.
At the time?
At the time.
The album he's working on for like 10 years.
So I took that one of those songs, and that became the song. I like the vibe because it was like this really like horns to hell kind of shit.
Yeah.
So it fit the Silent Hill vibe.
This is probably why the song Silent Hill only appears in the attract mode and credits of the game, because otherwise it might have clashed against the work of Daniel Licht. To put it bluntly, I feel Jonathan's contribution was a wasted opportunity, and the end result of this collaboration only served to validate the feelings of the unhinged fans who demanded more Yamaoka.
And I got a lot of shit for that because they were pissed that the original composer wasn't doing it. All these people were, how the fuck can you have that guy do it? And I think the majority of people enjoyed it.
You've been laughing at me all along, haven't you?
Hey, where'd you say that train is again?
Told you, just head on down into the caverns there. You'll find it.
The exploration in Downpour was more interesting than I remembered. It was nice to see a different side of town for a change, notably the sunny and beautiful mountainside of the Devil's Pit. Some of my favorite aspects of the past Silent Hill games were when they'd let you take in a brief bit of the normal world just before contrasting it against the darker environments of Silent Hill. It's important to provide the player some relief every once in a while when you're dealing in survival horror.
Yes. Now back to that Skytram.
The game doesn't truly open up until a couple of hours in, when you're finally free to roam the streets of Silent Hill. This is where Murphy can take on various mini mysteries in the town, which are independent of the main story, but sometimes they'll give you a little tidbit about Murphy to learn. The best side quest by far is the cinema level. Here you learn that Murphy was once a projectionist, and in this quest he has to splice a few film reels together, so he can last action hero his way into the big screen and find the secret that the film holds. And that secret is a golden gun, which is the most powerful handgun in the game. The big caveat, if you drop it, it's gone forever. Sadly, most of the side quests in the game play out in a similar fashion. Taking them on rarely yields anything worth the trouble of backtracking all the way across town, and most of the time you'll just end up with a couple of health kits or a weapon that will be taken from you forcefully by the cutscenes. Even worse, none of this content carries over into like a New Game Plus, which was a welcome feature to every Silent Hill entry up until this point. Many people tend to point out that Henry's apartment from Silent Hill 4 can be found in Downpour. Yeah, I guess it's cool, but it doesn't make any sense considering that Henry's apartment resided in Ashfield, which according to Downpour is 168 miles away from Silent Hill. Look, I'm no supernatural geographer, but come on, dude. Probably the most beneficial side quest you can undertake is doing Homer, the homeless guy's quests. You can trade with him some essential items like this candy bar, and then he'll open up shortcuts to navigate to the different parts of town.
See that?
There's tunnels all over Silent Hill, connecting one part of town to the other. You just gotta think like a rat, see? A rat's vermin, but he knows how to survive.
The most interesting puzzles to undertake are found within the main storyline quests. Downpour has some outstanding concepts that many have glossed over when pointing out its flaws. For instance, inside the orphanage, Murphy comes across an out-of-commission theater. In order to progress, he will need to set the stage for a play about a cabin in the woods. Having a bit of a theater background myself, I appreciated how Murphy had to set up the music, lights, and even produce some of the sound effects to solve this puzzle. At the completion of this, a rainstorm forms from inside the auditorium, and then Murphy has to traverse through a sprawling forest to get to the cabin. This is all inside the theater, and it's the game at its most creative. There are many other unique puzzles that are genuine head-scratchers if you choose to play the game on the harder puzzle difficulties, which I would recommend. I just wish some of them weren't interrupted by the combat, so I could truly take them in without all the distractions. Now, I wish I could say I was invested in the story, but it was difficult to connect with any of the characters because a lot of them just show up in one scene and then disappear forever. Primarily, there are two main plot lines to follow. The first, Murphy is riddled with the guilt of losing his son Charlie, who was abducted by Patrick Napier off screen. Murphy steals a car, so he can then get locked up to take his revenge out on Patrick. The writer's attempt at the big revelation of the kidnapping and murder of Charlie Pendleton is presented in the most cringe-inducing manner.
Where's my boy? Is he out there? Charlie! 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 Charlie!
Not to be an advocate for the child abduction plotline, but I'm not against broaching this subject matter in a video game if it was used effectively to inform the design of the monsters or influence the shape of the town by creating forms of symbolism which would have struck fear into Murphy and the player respectively. The symbolism here just comes off as sort of basic. Murphy's subconscious perspective of Silent Hill is manifested in the way of water because Charlie's body was found in a lake. Oh, and then Murphy was also a prisoner, so the other world is sometimes reflected as a prison. That's about as deep as it gets when it comes to the symbolism here. In town, Murphy can come across these caged birds, which he can free to unlock a brief memory of Charlie. Mostly it's just flashes of Murphy running through a field of flowers with a goofy-ass smile on his face, but it's doing something to build a connection with Charlie, and I think the game could have benefited from more levity. Maybe some flashbacks of happier times when Murphy was raising Charlie to afford us some emotional hooks to connect with him as a character. When you haven't made me care about a kid dying in your game, you got a problem with your script. The second main plot line involves Officer Cunningham, who is seeking revenge against Murphy. She blames Murphy for crippling her father, Frank Coleridge, who was a corrections officer at the prison where Murphy was held. He was an all-around decent person to Murphy and believed in his better angels. However, Murphy makes a deal with Sewell, a bad cop, where in exchange for killing Frank, he will get some alone time with Patrick Napier. The moral choices in the game determine whether or not Murphy went through with crippling Frank or if Sewell did it. Regardless of circumstance, two beings are manifested from Murphy's guilt, which act as the primary antagonists in Downpour. There's a punishment-dealing entity known as the Boogeyman, which may also be Murphy at the same time. Then there's the disfigured, wheelchair-bound specter of Frank Coleridge that appears throughout town. He's known as the Wheelman. Originally, the game was set to have an entirely separate campaign starring Anne, who may have had her own personalized version of Silent Hill, which might have crossed over at some point with Murphy's, and I believe the Wheelman was manifested from her subconscious rather than Murphy's. Most of the ideas for Anne's campaign were likely folded into the graphic novel Anne's Story, which does take place right after she falls into the canyon. Regardless, both of the plot lines converge near the end when Murphy has to quite literally pull the plug on Frank, and then Anne confronts Murphy about the torment she endured when caring for her disabled father.
And I had to watch this wonderful man shit and piss all over himself, day after day after day.
Here's where things get muddled, as Murphy then turns into the boogeyman before Anne's eyes. Whose personal demon is this anyway? In this scene, the player gets to don the raincoat and wield the cinder block hammer to take out Anne, who's releasing waves and waves of prisoners to kill Murphy. As the boogeyman, you can swing your hammer down and release shockwaves in a line to take out the prisoners and Anne. This is just another case where Deadly Premonition did it better. The entire plot hinges on the moral choice made in this moment. There are 6 total endings to the game, but you can only qualify for 3 outcomes at a time. 1, if you let Anne kill you, you'll get an ending where the prisoner-officer roles are reversed and Murphy's now a cop. 2, you can kill Anne and then get the bad karma ending. 3, spare Anne and then get the good karma or neutral karma ending. Depending on which way you go, you'll either get an okay ending, in which our characters make peace with each other, or an absolute disaster of an ending that creates one big fat plot hole.
This is it, Pendleton. Any last words?
Yeah. I'll see you in hell. Cupcake.
Despite being imperfect, I had a better experience with Downpour this time around. Enough time has passed and I'm not as salty about it as I once was. I've since come to consider the Western-developed Silent Hill games to kind of just exist in their own spin-off canon, similar to the Halloween franchise. Sure, some of the Western games lack the renowned atmosphere and subtle horror of the originals, but some are campy enough or present a unique idea to let them stand out on their own. I like to treat Silent Hill Downpour as a low-budget, straight-to-DVD sequel to an all-time classic movie, just like something you'd rent out of a Redbox for a weekend, which I did back in the day. Sure, it's graphically inferior, the music is forgettable and stock, it really falls apart at the end, and it's a piece of shit! But as long as you have the right coping mechanisms, you too can appreciate this time-honored classic. Above all else, I think being tied to the Silent Hill brand held Downpour back from being a decent standalone title. To their credit, Vatra attempted to distance the game's story from the established lore of the Japanese-developed titles by removing all the cult aspects. They even showed some restraint by not shoehorning in Pyramid Head where he didn't belong like Climax did in Silent Hill Homecoming. From what I've pieced together from interviews with the team, the aim was to create an anthology of Western Silent Hill games and comics, all of which could be independently enjoyed without an overarching plot to follow, but at some points would include occasional cameos or nods to the other Western-developed titles. The postman, Howard Blackwood, was set to appear in each new entry as a regular cast member, acting as sort of a spiritual guide to Silent Hill, and he would occasionally get involved with the story. Howard appears in the graphic novels Silent Hill Past Life and Anne's Story, which respectively act as a prequel and concurrent story to Downpour. He also makes an appearance in the final entry of the Western line, Silent Hill Book of Memories. Howard delivers the titular Book of Memories to the protagonist and also doubles as the game's shopkeeper.
I give up. You found me. What's your pleasure?
When I took the anthological perspective to the Western series, I began to appreciate them more on that basis. Vatra tried a lot of things to make Silent Hill Downpour work, but many of their attempts were in vain, and the studio closed shortly after the game released. Now that I think about it, they should have just dropped the Silent Hill branding entirely and named the game something like Murphy's Law.